from the Library of Congress and the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture.
Good morning. Today is December 14th, 2015. This is David Cline from the History Department at Virginia Tech and also working with the Southern Oral History Program at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. I'm here today on the campus of Wesley Seminary with Maynard Moore, and I'll ask you, if you would, to just introduce yourself, and then we'll have a conversation.
All right. My name is Maynard Moore, and I've been in Washington for the last 35 years. So.
Great. So if we could start with just ask you a little bit about where you were born and raised, and we'll talk a little bit about your childhood.
Well, I was born in Petersburg, Virginia in 1938, which is fairly important as a context for me personally, because it was my home until I went away from college, so that I was raised in Petersburg, and this was a southern town, still is a southern town in many important respects. Had a long history and was the scene of a decisive battle in the Civil War, it's where the Union troops dug a tunnel under the Confederate works, and ultimately by an accidental trigger, they were planting dynamite and blew up the Confederate works, and it's now a historic site, the crater. And people in Petersburg never forgot that, and would place that as a prominent event in the history of the town. It was a commercial center for decades before and after the Civil War, mainly a rail head and switching area for tobacco, and the economy had been boosted in the early 20th century with the establishment of Fort Lee, Camp Lee, but now Fort Lee, as a quartermaster depot for the Army. So lots of money and people flowed into the area in World War II when I was growing up. My family was Methodist. We were members of Washington Street United Methodist Church. There were 10 Methodist churches in the town. We had a town of 35,000 people, and there were equivalent number of Baptists and other churches, so that was very much part of the life of the town. All of which were segregated, of course. My home church has a placard out in front of the church now on the wall that marks the spot that says in 1846, this was the site where the Methodist Church South was organized. And that was when the Methodist churches in the South broke over the issue of slavery from the Methodist Church in the North. And so that placard still stands to mark that occasion.
And this was your home church?
That was my home church. That's where I grew up, and where I felt the call to ministry. I was a member of the youth group, and subsequently participated in the Methodist student movement in the district, and then was elected to statewide office in the Methodist student movement when I was a senior in high school.
So Maynard, in your childhood, growing up in Petersburg and in this particular church, was the segregation of the time were racial issues talked about, either at home or in the church?
No. Nobody addressed racial issues, probably by design, unspoken. And for the most part, during those years, I was asleep. It was not an issue on my radar screen, nor with my family. It was the way of life. We lived on one of the main cross streets in town, and the way the town was organized, and as typical of most southern towns, the cross streets were those that were occupied by the black population. So we had black folks in our neighborhood, so to speak, but not on the main streets, and they were on the cross streets that were less cared for. But I grew up playing with black kids until it was time to go to junior high school. At that point, my mother explained to me that they would no longer be welcome in our house, as had previously been the case. I had always invited my black friends to come in to the house for watch a Howdy Doody show, or have cookies and ice cream, or you know, and I visited in their houses. But at the point where we went to junior high school, that was no more interaction. And some of my best buddies in the black, among those black kids,